team is absolutely everything. And I don't say this lightly. And it isn't just a team that is executed in other spaces. I was in the high-tech boom and its subsequent bust. And there was a period of time where you could just pluck somebody out of, Harvard or Yale or Princeton and put them in a high-tech company in an executive C-suite role. They would look great on paper and the company would have a success when going public. That's not the kind of team I'm talking about when I look at cannabis companies. Your current pedigree may or may not have any relevance in cannabis. To succeed in cannabis, you need an executive team that has incredible grit, is incredibly nimble, and has the ability to pivot.
Welcome to another episode of Capital Cathy, the show that talks about women who have gone through the financing process for their business. With roughly 2% of investment capital going towards women-founded businesses, Capital Cathy discusses the hurdles women face in financing and how to navigate the waters to secure funding for their companies. Today's episode, we have Sally Nichols, co-founder and president of Bloom Farms, a California vape, flower, and CBD brand that is making their way across the country. Welcome to the show, Sally.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. In addition to Bloom Farms, you're also the president and co-founder of Girl Ventures, a startup investment fund geared around women-owned and operated businesses. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So Girl Ventures was started by my business partner and I, Allison Agley, back in the late 90s. And we started it originally for our own purposes. We'd done a couple of real estate ventures that were successful, and we realized that there were other women looking for early stage capital to do smaller projects, and we decided to start Girl Ventures with some of the proceeds of successes we'd had, and really our goal was to support early stage female entrepreneurs. What we've learned along the years is, and it's been quite an amazing trajectory from 1998, to present day. But there's the role that we play, at Girl Ventures is still very much relevant today in terms of capital, support, advisory services, et cetera.
It's a great resource for women, who are embarking on this wonderful fundraising adventures. Can you tell us a little bit about how you first got involved in the cannabis industry and what you were actually doing prior to joining the industry?
Sure. So I'll start with what I was doing prior because I think it's super relevant to anybody in an entrepreneurial with an entrepreneurial mindset. I realized early on in my life that one of the things I'm really good at is building something from nothing. And whether that was things that I did, as a child, all the way up to my experience in high school and college. And pretty much, the moment I graduated from USC in Los Angeles, the very first thing I did was write a business plan and go out and get funding for my first company. There was really no concept of what it means to be an entrepreneur. And I'll date myself here. I graduated from USC in 1994, and there was really a very, very narrow definition of what it meant to be an entrepreneur. And in many cases, the face of an entrepreneur was a young male face. And at the time, I didn't realize what I was doing was entrepreneurial. I just believed that what I was doing was creating something out of nothing. Fast forward, the very first business that I started turned into the first online educational service for children throughout California. Eventually I did that in conjunction with the California Department of Education, Department of Environmental Education, the Disney, GTE, back then a telecom company, Apple Computer and IBM, and several foundations. And it was really my first experience in building something out of nothing when it requires finance and support from other people. And, if I look back over, my successes and my failures, everything in my professional career has really been tied to creating things from scratch. So, fast forward, I married my husband in 2001. And prior to that, my husband's family is also very entrepreneurial, and they had purchased a company called K-Swiss. At the time, they purchased it outright from the owners at $11 million. And then we as a family built the company, took it public, grew it to over $1 billion in valuation, over $800 million in sales. And so I kind of lived this very kind of dichotomous world where on one hand, I was building and selling and had gone on to create new high-tech ventures and exit them, et cetera, alongside building, a publicly traded company. And so my lens on the world ended up, was very unique in that, I could see how publicly traded, big successful CPG companies were built, how they were succeeding, and what were the ingredients in that success. And I could compare it along the small fledgling businesses that I was creating or supporting or funding. And I was clear, what those companies needed to do to get to the place that they could be a K-Swiss. So fast forward, a tremendous amount of learning during that time. And if we just want to date it, I would say it was from 1994, all the way until about 2014 or 2012. In 2012, as a family, we decided to exit to sell K-Swiss, and we set aside a certain amount of money for a private family office. Also, in parallel with that, Allison, my partner in Girl Ventures, and I had a couple of successes. In our last venture, we had licensed some intellectual property to a pharmaceutical company, and we set aside a small fund that we could use for investments. Allison at the time was living in Colorado, and she said, "Sally, we should start looking at cannabis." These companies, while cannabis is kind of a quote unquote a legacy product, many of these companies are fledgling companies. They're startups, just like we've worked with for the past 15 years. I'm sure they could really benefit from our experience on the startup side. Alongside that, we had the Nichols family fund that had all of the experience on building and scaling companies and being a publicly traded company. And basically both entities, the Nichols Family Fund and Girl Ventures, decided that we were both going to start playing in the cannabis space. And it was, to be completely frank, it was all originated by Allison, who at the time was living in Colorado and saw a tremendous amount of momentum on the recreation side, whereas in California we had seen a lot of momentum on medical. So the trajectory into cannabis was kind of twofold. I think, coming out of high tech days on one side, and then also coming out of CPG with K-Swiss shoes, both Allison and I and the Nichols family, we were looking for products that have, a market segment that was open, the ability to get in early into companies, and help shape and grow and frame the opportunity. We were also looking for brands and products that stood the test of time. I think we all know that cannabis has been around for generations, and the biggest shift wasn't a user shift with people starting to use cannabis. The biggest shift was turning it into a legal CPG product. So for us, we saw a lot of opportunity and potential stability in the future of cannabis, and we decided to separately and in a combined fashion focus energies in that direction.
So what can you say the industry looked like when you entered versus where it is now? What are some of the biggest differences from then until now?
I would say that some of the biggest differences is really, I would say first and foremost, it's access to solid legal services. And the reason I start with access to quality legal services is that something that has plagued the industry in general is proper, corporate governance documents, the shaping of businesses, shareholder agreements, et cetera. There's always been access to capital, both in the early stages of cannabis and in the current stages. And while the form of that capital may be shifting, the fundamental difference was, did early stage startups have access to good legal guidance? Did they have access to good financial guidance? And certainly early on in the cannabis days, they did not. Many large established startup law firms would not touch cannabis because it was still federally illegal, independent of what was happening at the state level. So there was a lot of trial and error on in the legal side of document formation and corporate governance formation, which created a tremendous amount of headache and uncertainty, and unfortunately, a lot of struggle for the early cannabis business, certainly for investors and absolutely for founders. So that's one thing that's really shifted. I think another thing that's really shifted, and again, we're going to separate anything related to regulatory changes then and now. Let's just look at some of the mechanics. Access to capital has shifted. And with that access to capital comes a new level of sophistication. It certainly comes in the form of how startup ventures are vetted, how they're perceived, how they're looked at, how they're evaluated. But it also comes with the amount of money available for companies to scale. Early on in the cannabis space, it was really about passing the hat and building an investment round off of immediate friends and family and access to any kind of high net worth capital. Well, fast forward now, there are several funds that focus almost exclusively on the cannabis business. Obviously, one of the first was Privateer, and there's a handful of others. You have Gotham Green, and there's plenty of funds that exist almost exclusively to service cannabis and its ancillary markets. So as a result of broader access to capital, we're also experiencing more sophisticated access to capital with higher demands on expectations on company performance and tighter regulations around board governance and things like that. So you're seeing the industry grow up in many ways. And there is attrition in that process where you're losing, there's often the conversation around, well, women aren't getting funded anymore. It's just male related companies, et cetera, et cetera. There is a level of attrition that happens with that growth, and lots of business ideas and entrepreneurs end up getting weeded out in that time frame. That's both positive, but it's also negative for the space, and it's something that we'll continue to struggle with. Another thing that's really changed in this space, I think, is from a regulatory perspective, is the freedom in which we have to admit that we are both investors and operators in cannabis. In 2014, when Allison and I made our first investment in cannabis, it was super, super quiet. We certainly didn't talk to people about what we were doing. We had issues with getting paid in cash and how we moved that cash into bank accounts. And, it was definitely something that you were not very open about. You were investing in cannabis because you believed in the potential of the market. You believed in the potential of the plant. You wanted social, you kind of wanted, social changes as it relates to incarceration and the impact the drug wars had on minorities. Lots of times people were in the cannabis business early on for early social reasons. And so there wasn't this kind of wide discussion about what we were doing. Now, fast forward to today, I can't swing my arm without somebody bragging about their cannabis investment. It's almost like a sign of their, their kind of, level of modernity or sophistication alongside their friends and colleagues. So that shift in mindset, in many ways, I think is driving larger cultural adoption of cannabis. But it's definitely a difference between 2013 and 14 and today.
So as an investor, what is it that you specifically look for when you're making investments? Is it the management team? Is it financial projections? What can an entrepreneur go into a meeting and what should they know? What advice would you give them in regards to hoping to land an investment?
Well, in the cannabis space, your team is absolutely everything. And I don't say this lightly. There are, and it isn't just a team that is executed in other spaces. I remember in the early high tech, and I was in the high tech boom, and its subsequent bust. And there was a period of time where you could just pluck somebody out of, Harvard or Yale or Princeton and put them in a high-tech company in an executive C-suite role, they would look great on paper and the company would have a success when going public. That's not the kind of team I'm talking about when I look at cannabis companies. Actually, your current pedigree may or may not have any relevance in cannabis. I mean, to succeed in cannabis, you need an executive team that has incredible grit, is incredibly nimble, and has the ability to pivot. And if I just look at Bloom Farms, the number of times we've had to pivot to adjust with the regulatory environment, and then changes in the regulatory environment, and then rolling in testing, and then dealing with VapeGate, and then dealing with, opportunistic competitors and lack of regulation and lack of enforcement. I would say that every 15 to 30 days, we as executives are in a position of having to pivot or modify our business. So the team for me is everything in cannabis. And I'll speak for a minute, like one investment that I made that I'm very proud of is I made an early stage investment in a delivery service, in a female owned and operated delivery service in Northern California called Sava. And on paper, a classic investor may not have invested in Sava from the beginning. There was no MBA on the immediate roster. Andrea, the founder of Sava, came from a nonprofit background, and a lot of the boxes may not have been checked that a classic investor would be looking for. But for me, what I saw as an opportunity with Sava, and I still see as one of the things that has driven her success, is coming out of a nonprofit background. Andrea is incredibly adept at stretching a dollar. And when you're in a cash-driven business that has challenges accessing capital, the ability to make your dollar really work for you and to manage short-term, middle-term, and long-term expenses really makes the difference between succeeding and failing in cannabis. Also her nonprofit background was fascinating to me because, nonprofits generally deal with some kind of regulatory or social issue. And cannabis is riddled with both regulatory issues and in many cases is driven by a certain social ideology. So she was perfectly lined up to be able to speak to, address, and manage and operate in and around those challenges. So, a team's ability to navigate the current and any potential water in cannabis really becomes a driving factor of any investment that we've made. Another important factor, there's just some basic things. Obviously, you want to know that you have a business that makes good economic sense. You want to understand that the total available footprint of that business is one that is sustainable and has the ability to grow. You also want to make sure that business itself is scalable, that, should multi-state sales become an eventuality, you want this business to be able to scale into new markets. What I probably rely on less, and maybe I'm a bit of a skeptic, is I probably rely less on projections. I can do some of those projections in my own head when I look at the cannabis business. I know what California looks like. I know what Nevada looks like. I know what, Massachusetts and some of the other ancillary markets look like. And on a good day, projections are management team's best guess at what can happen. But I also know that cannabis throws, a wrench into the works on a routine basis. So the projections are a best guess, but not the number one reason why I'm investing in the business. I'm really investing in the team and scalability.
Right. Very important, as well as, like you said, being able to stretch the dollar in this industry, and for women in general, where only 2% of investments go to women-founded businesses. Why do you suppose that is? Why do you think the number is so low when we know that there are so many incredible companies that can really change the world out there, but they're underfunded, they're not, they don't have a seat at the table? Why do you think that only 2% of investment goes to women?
Well, I to be honest, I think some of the potential deals that women put forward die on the table. They die on the presentation table, and they die because I hear business pitches all the time. Women pitch from a different I think from a different position than some male businesses, and that while that's changing, it takes time for that change to show in the numbers. Women, you really have to understand, the mindset of an investor. An investor isn't giving you money because they think your idea is good. Your idea could be fantastic, but an investor is giving you money because they're betting that their $500,000 invested in your business is going to make them more money than that same $500,000 invested in other places. And so the pitch, the making money pitch that is missing many times from a female investment deck is really where I think things go sideways. Female investors need to continue to evolve their language as it relates to businesses making money for their investors. And I can say, like, for example, when Bloom Farms is working on an investment deck, or really we could talk about company X, Y, or Z, there are fundamental components that go into that investment round, alongside the opportunity of the business itself and the growth of the business, and the use of proceeds that they're getting for that business. There's a consideration for the deal itself. And, there's an old saying that I hear from my father-in-law from Casos all the time. He's like, I would rather have a mediocre deal in an exceptional company than an exceptional deal in a mediocre company. And so, the offering that is being put forth alongside the business proposition in some cases is more important than the business plan itself. Are you giving your investors a solid enough position in your company and an opportunity to make money and protections on the downside in case you don't live up to your expectations and you don't make the money, you don't grow the way you expect to grow? So there's a package that goes along with presenting your business idea at an early stage, and I think that sometimes those pieces are missing from female-driven presentation. There are also many, many women that come to the table with exceptional presentations across the board. The value proposition is there. It's the right deal. There's the right path to growth. It's an excellent management team. And I think that's where culture comes into play. And that's a much harder topic to talk about because it's really hard to understand. We have generations of cultural bias where we're used to seeing our CEOs and our presidents as men, and in many cases seeing them as white men. And I don't mean to say this to offend anybody. I just think that at a certain point we're raised seeing certain things and identifying certain things with success. And it takes time and experience and mind shift and visibility for the world to see a woman as a CEO and to see a woman as, as an entrepreneurial success. I think that there's a lot more focus on successful women, which I think is changing the mindset significantly. But I do believe that culture plays a role in that. There's a third thing I think plays a role in it. So after you have the quality of the pitch and then you have kind of the cultural challenges, I think the third challenge is more operational. People like to do business with people that they know or that they have worked with in the past. And so when cannabis first started, there was a tremendous representation of women at the space. We were all coming up in the space together. We were self-funding. We were bootstrapping. We were growing. As new capital came into the market and people executives pivoted from other industries into cannabis, when it came time to executing, they brought their friends along, their quote unquote friends, the people that they executed alongside before in their previous life, whether they came from pharma or alcohol or banking. And so you see this kind of import of people into cannabis from other industries. And in many cases, it's people bringing their teams with them or bringing their key executives along with them where they have had success before. And so you get that carryover, that historical carryover on culture and perception that drove kind of a male-oriented thinking and business world. And that's kind of how it bleeds into the new world. You bring the people that you know and have worked with before. I don't believe that and I have not personally seen any intention around excluding female investors or not considering female-driven businesses. And in fact, Bloom Farms launched an initiative about a year and a half or 2 years ago, I think about a year and a half ago now, that we were going to be purchasing 50% of our supply chain from female-owned and operated businesses in California. And it was interesting. It was with that intention. We had both success and we had some interesting comments, which, I think also kind of informed my thinking on this. But the first success with it is that, we were really able to secure some of the best supply chain in California for a handful of our SKUs for a period of time. And it was, and supporting those female-owned and operated businesses we found was easier than we thought because we were already working with most of them and they were already standout leaders in their particular discipline. But what we found that was a little bit more challenging is the minute we articulated we were doing that, the minute we stated we were doing that, and that was a pledge for the company, I had to field a couple questions. And some of those questions were, does that mean that you'd be taking inferior product just to meet your 50% quota? And I thought that was very interesting because it was actually the opposite. In many cases, the quality of product that we were sourcing was superior. And so, these things kind of, over time inform the intersection of, of cultural mindset, of people working with people they know, and just, classic business economics on the way pitches are presented, and how those things all bleed together to create, an environment for, women in business.
To succeed, absolutely.
Yeah.
Mentorship is huge, and some might even say that an investment is great, but being mentored either by your investor or by an ally is just as good, if not better. How are you working? Are you mentoring other women in this industry? Are you working closely? What is some of the mentorship like on your end?
Mm-hmm. Well, the cannabis business is incredibly grueling and insanely time consuming. So it's not always easy for me to mentor women outside of Bloom Farms, or really kind of on a broader level at the moment. I mean, I'm a huge fan of what Andrea is doing at Sava, and, we support her, in any way we can, and, in lots of different levels. And there's a couple of other businesses that I work alongside to support. But I would say my biggest contribution to mentorship really exists inside Bloom Farms. And, when I started at Bloom Farms, there were no women at a director level. And now I think almost all but one of our director level positions are female. And we didn't place females in those positions. We didn't go outside and pluck somebody in and say, hey, we're going to give a female this role. Instead, we made a commitment as a company that we were going to be grooming both men and women from the ground up and move them up and into the company in positions of leadership, as opposed to finding new roles in the company and hiring from outside. So, for example, Kelsey Riley, who is the head of our CBD operations, she started with us 2.5 years ago, coming out of a dispensary where she had first been a bud tender and then moved into running the dispensary. And, she came into Bloom Farms, and over a period of a couple of years, we have worked with what she already has as an incredible base of talent, commitment, grit, and tenacity. And, she's now the director of operations for the whole CBD line, and the whole CBD business. We also have, other female directors in the space that came to us, at entry level positions. So a lot of the work that I'm doing now is really around building a business and grooming the staff that we have inside Bloom Farms and grooming them up in the business by organically teaching and growing and evolving, extra training as needed, and giving people a fair shot across the board at any job we have in the company. I read this fascinating article a couple of years ago. I'm trying to remember the name of it. I'm a big fan of the Harvard Business Review magazine, and I read it all the time. And there was a great series that was about the cost of employee acquisition, and it talked about how, you know, when companies grow, they often look outside their company to bring in key executives to fill spaces versus giving that same opportunity to their existing employees. And as a result, they're paying more for that position, and they're capping the growth of their existing employees. And, you know, we talked about this internally at Bloom Farms, and we made, you know, a significant commitment to the fact that we were going to continue to groom as many of our people up the food chain as possible and give them opportunity and advance their skill set. And I have to say, it has made us a stronger company, and it has made us better executors. So I would welcome the opportunity to be able to mentor women, you know, more broadly. You know, right now I think that my plate is so full. I do a lot of speaking engagements also that are geared around female-only audiences and female entrepreneurship, and I do kind of support women in that capacity, and just through information exchange. But really my focus is on at the moment on growing and evolving Bloom Farms and our amazing team.
Great. You know, building up from within. I think that's fantastic, and you know, hopefully
way harder than you think.
Yeah.
I mean, it's way harder than you think. I always, you know, but it is definitely worth it. Yeah.
So when you know, you're at these speaking engagements or you're working with other women and maybe you're talking about, you know, closing on some financing, what advice or what can you say to actually closing the deal? This seems to be a hard, you know, in sales, it can be hard to close the deal. What would you say about that part of it? And, you know, what might make it easier for some entrepreneurs, or how can an entrepreneur go from having, you know, good conversation to solidifying?
That is an outstanding question, and it's a skill set. It's a skill set as much as it is a team effort. And so, you know, when I look at the different rounds of capital that I've been involved in raising over the years, you know, everybody ends up playing a little bit different role in the process. You know, there's the offering and the pitch docs, you know, positioning your, you know, your business, how you're pitching your story. There's the actual pitch discussions and with investors. There's and then there's the closing and the momentum that's created around that. I find that it's usually really helpful. You have to have a lead no matter what you're doing. There needs to be one person that's willing to step forward and be the lead. And the lead usually gets a slightly better kind of a slightly better like a sweetener in the deal for being the first one to step forward. And it's really about getting that lead and creating the momentum, setting timeframes around the close, and being clear that the people you're talking to are actually committed to doing the deal. I mean, I've seen entrepreneurs have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 conversations with one investor over, you know, $100,000 commit that ultimately, you know, should really have only been 2 or 3 conversations before you could suss out whether they were a real lead or not. So I think one of the first things that has to happen is you really have to qualify the people you're talking to and make sure that you're talking to people who are capable of writing the check, genuinely interested and able to write the check, and who have done investments before. That kind of helps frame the thinking, your odds on, you know, on whether these people are going to convert for you. But ultimately you need that lead, and you need to kind of circle that lead with qualified people who are able to close. You need to create momentum and hold people's feet to the fire. I think it's really easy for investors to get dragged down in meeting after meeting after meeting without a commit. And at a certain point, if you don't get a commit, you need to move along and let people know that, you know, you're here to raise money, you're here to build your business, And, you're not here for 15 conversations about exactly the same thing. That we understand if you're not going to be able to do this right now, but, we'll check in with you, on our next round. But don't be afraid to keep moving, and keep looking for people who are going to follow through. But generally, if you're giving a good offer, and people are genuinely interested, they shouldn't have an issue writing a check, especially when they know that you're prepared to execute on things as soon as that money's in, that's going to turn their money into more than what they gave you. So I think ultimately it's about properly vetting the people you're talking to, having a lead, creating momentum, setting a close date, and then following through.
Completely agreed. And, in that regard of doing your due diligence on the investor, what would you say to entrepreneurs that, they're desperate to close and, maybe that investor just doesn't feel right, or maybe, they're hesitant to take a promissory note? What can you say to people that, they believe in their company, maybe their finances are pretty tight, they really need to close? Would you discourage people from closing if you just, sense something is off, or would you encourage them
Absolutely.
to further
I'll tell you what. There's two things that I'll say. One, no money is better than bad money. And I've seen a lot of people get into trouble with investors that they take money from that they don't feel good about. And then those investors turn around to create trouble and havoc for them as a business, number one. So I would definitely say, if you don't feel good about the money now, I wouldn't take it. The second thing I would say is that not all money is equal, right? Money that's coming from someone who's invested and had success before and built other businesses, we call that kind of smart money, or money that adds value, is definitely more important and more valuable in many cases than the money that's coming from the first time investor. So, it's like you have to be comfortable walking away, and you have to be careful who you take money from. All money is not the same. And if you smell that something's off, you have to trust that instinct. Of course, you don't want to trust your instinct to the point that you throw the baby out with the bathwater, just because someone, doesn't agree with you on one of the premises of your business doesn't mean that they're not a good potential investor. You want people that are able to question you and hold your feet to the fire. However, if you get a funny feeling about a working relationship with someone that is off, you have to listen to that.
Very true. All too true.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm coming up towards the end here, and my final question, which I like to throw at people, is if you had a crystal ball, and if you could tell us the future of cannabis and women's role in this industry for the next 5 years, what would your crystal ball tell you?
Oh man. Well, so I think that amazing executors will continue to have an incredible future in cannabis. And, I can swing my arm and hit 15 amazing women in the cannabis space that are executives and continue to be successful and grow and build their business. So I don't see any reason why that won't continue. I actually see the place of women in cannabis evolving in a positive way as more sophisticated female entrepreneurs enter the space. They enter the space with new, more innovative ideas, with products that are geared to function in particular for women and women's issues. I see all of those as possibilities, and all of those as, in many cases, eventualities in the space. What I struggle with in terms of the crystal ball is, so much of the opportunity in cannabis is based on where we go with federal legalization. Some of these markets that are even legal for rec or medical right now are very small, highly competitive, and incredibly supply constrained markets. And so the challenge there is like women or entrepreneurs in general will jump into these smaller constrained markets with great ideas, not realizing how market constraint itself and supply constraint will keep them from succeeding, having nothing to do with their general business idea. So what I think will really drive the future of cannabis for women and for men and for minorities across the board is federal legalization. And I don't necessarily think it's going to help in a good way. So people always say to me, Sally, aren't you anxious for federal legalization? And, to be honest with you, my answer right now is not so much. I think that with federal legalization will come a tremendous amount of money and competition from well-established industries, alcohol, pharmaceutical, et cetera. And with that, we will lose immediately some of the smaller craft brands that are just getting off the mark, some of the really interesting cannabinoidal-driven innovation and kind of product opportunities that exist while the market is relatively quote unquote small. So what I see happening over the next 5 years is a slow bleed into legalization, and with that slow bleed, I believe we'll continue to have interesting and innovative products, evolution on the supply chain of cannabis, a slow evolution on who enters the space, how they enter the space, and what they're able to affect, and an opening of capital markets that will hopefully fuel all of it. It's my genuine hope that there is no wide scale legalization overnight. I think it would create a tremendous amount of chaos and uncertainty in an industry that is already struggles with constant change.
Absolutely. I agree. I hope it is a slow transformation versus overnight. So for our listeners out there, if they want to get in touch with you or they want to, do some more research on Bloom Farms or Girl Ventures, where can we direct them to?
Well, Bloom Farms has two different websites which service the two different sides of our business. We have getbloomfarms.com, which is our cannabis company in California. And then we have Bloom Farms CBD, which is our CBD business, which our CBD is sold in 37 states in the U.S. and 6 countries. We're just barely a year old and having incredible success. And the beautiful thing about the CBD is you can also just buy it online. You can see us online. As far as resources in the space, I encourage everybody to anyone interested in cannabis to follow the financial news about the space. Follow, what the public companies are doing, how they're trading, who their investors are. What are the private brands that are succeeding and growing and winning? What are the markets that are generating the majority of the revenue in the space? Really dig in and say to yourself, what am I good at in my current life, in my current industry, in my current world, and how could that translate? And do your homework. It's not an easy space. And you will easily work twice as much as you do in any other industry that you're in right now. But I can promise you it will be incredibly rewarding and an experience that you will live to tell your grandchildren. The stories from cannabis have been amazing. The people have been extraordinary, and I wouldn't change it for a minute.
It is a magical ride, I have to say. Never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment. And I'm really glad that you're doing this this podcast. I think that and I really hope that women think long and hard about the language of money and how they can translate their business idea into a language of money. I think that there's women with incredible power and genius, and their voice and products need to be heard and seen. And I think that change change and opportunity is inevitable.
I agree. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming on the show today. I really enjoyed this interview. And I really enjoyed, getting to know you and to hear your story and I look forward to seeing where Bloom Farms is and to seeing how this industry evolves and how women continue to evolve and lead in this industry. So thank you again for coming on the show with us today.
My pleasure, truly. Anytime.